Hi everybody, my name is Allison and I am going to talk today about how we produce ATP from glucose and palmitate. I want to start off by talking about how glucose is coming from carbohydrate and palmitate comes from a substrate called fats. And with these molecules, we're able to produce ATP. ATP is energy, so let's just first start talking about what ATP is all about. So what we notice here on the screen is the molecule adenosine triphosphate, which stands for ATP. On our left, we see that there is a triphosphate molecule binded by a ribose and binded by an adenine. The ribose and the adenine together make adenosine, and the left molecule makes triphosphate, and together it makes adenosine triphosphate. As we notice in the triphosphate molecule, there are phosphogens, and there are phosphates, and there are oxygens, and it's a high energy binded molecule. So we need this molecule in order for us to drive any cellular function because it is the most high energy. It's the cell's energy currency. So what happens with these oxygens is we need oxygen phosphorylation to be able to produce this. So to get this molecule, oxygen is very important. We also notice in the other molecules that there's carbons and there's nitrogens and there's also more oxygen, and we need this in order for us to use these electrons to transport later on to our electron transport chain. And that happens later on. So let's start off with the first stage in breaking down glucose, which is glycolysis. Glycolysis is basically a reaction that allows, or a process, sorry, to break down glucose into pyruvate. So there are two types of glycolysis. There is an anaerobic glycolysis and there is an aerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen. As we notice that pyruvate can be turned into lactate or acetyl-CoA. With pyruvate turning into lactate, that is an anaerobic process, and with pyruvate turning into acetyl-CoA, that is an aerobic process. But let's first talk about how we even get to pyruvate. So let's go into our 10 enzymatic reactions that occur in order to get pyruvate. There are 10 steps, and there are 10 enzymes that allow us to form ATP in order for us to continue to get more ATP. So the first stage is the anaerobic stage of glycolysis, which is a more rapid type of process, which means it occurs quicker. And the enzymes allow these chemical reactions to either speed up or slow down. So what we notice in these steps is that at steps 7 and 10, the enzymes allow them to produce ATP. Also, in step 6, there's the NADH. NADH is very important later on because it uses the electrons in order to form ATP. So we need that for cellular oxidation and also just to get the ATP. So when we talk about these enzymes and these steps, this is a very important part in order to move on to the next step, which is getting pyruvate. So it's the product of the anaerobic glycolysis that we just spoke about, and it allows us to either form lactate or acetyl-CoA. The reason why lactate is very important also is it's able to be used in the electron transport chain later on, which makes sense because it's an anaerobic process. It needs oxygen in order to continue to produce ATP. And then also pyruvate can be broken down to carbon dioxide and water, which has hydrogen and also oxygen in order for us to continue to gain ATP. The second type of glycolysis is the citric acid cycle. It's also known as the Krebs cycle. So what we do with the citric acid cycle is it is an aerobic process, meaning it uses oxygen in order to try to get more ATP. So what we notice here is that pyruvate it uses a transport protein, and it also forms some NADH, which is needed later on to form ATP, and then also it turns out to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA releases carbon dioxide and 4 pairs of hydrogen. These molecules are needed in order to get ATP. And also, it's allowing for these molecules to use these electrons to form more ATP molecules. So at the end of glycolysis, we get 2 pyruvates, 4 ATP molecules, and 2 NADH. It's great that we have our pyruvates and we have our NADHs, so that way we're able to get more ATP later on by using the electron transport chain. So now we get into the electron transport chain, and basically this is an aerobic process as well. It uses oxygen and binds to hydrogen in order for us to be able to form ATP molecules. So when we break down the glucose molecule, we go through a cycle of glycolysis, we go through another cycle of the citric acid cycle, also known as aerobic glycolysis, and then we also go through the electron transport chain where electrons are transferred in order to gain ATP by making that molecule. So we also have the NADH and another molecule called FADH that's able to form together in order to form ATP molecules. So like I said earlier, we have the glycolysis cycle, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And within all of this, 32 adenosine triphosphates are formed. So with a complete breakdown of that glucose molecule, we'll get 32 ATP. What's more important is understanding that there's all these processes that are needed in order to get to that point. When we talk about anaerobic glycolysis, it is without oxygen, which allows us to use lactate later on for the electron transport chain. With the citric acid cycle, it uses oxygen to form acetyl-CoA, or the citric acid uses acetyl-CoA to form ATP. And that way we can go into the electron transport chain to be able to get more ATP. Now we'll talk about palmitate. So palmitate is a 16 carbon saturated fatty acid. Like we talked about before, we need oxygen in order for us to be able to form ATP. And our carbon saturated fatty acid is formed with hydrogen bonds. And we're able to break down that fatty acid chain to form ATP through beta oxidation. So beta oxidation forms acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA is very necessary in order for us to get adenosine triphosphate. And the reason why adenosine triphosphate is very important because it's our energy source, and it's also broken down into the NADHs and the FADHs. In order for us to get those molecules, we have to use our glycolysis stages, and we're also able to get the acetyl-CoAs from there to form more ATP. So at the end of beta oxidation, we get 1 NADH, 1 FADH2, and 1 acetyl-CoA. And we go to several rounds of this beta oxidation in order to get the full breakdown of palmitate. So the 3 stages to break down palmitate is that it produces the NADHs and the FADHs to make ATP. The citric acid cycle gets acetyl-CoA into the carbon dioxide, and hydrogen atoms oxidize via electron transport oxidative phosphorylation. The oxidative phosphorylation is very, very important because we need oxygen in order to make ATP. Thank you so much.